Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. Welcome back to the session. My name is Basani Baloyi. I am at the Institute for Economic Justice, the Climate, Energy and Infrastructure Program Lead at the Institute for Economic Justice. I will be moderating the session on macroeconomic policy, industrial policy, and social protection responses to the COVID-19. I expect this to be a very explosive debate because not only is it happening, within theoretical debates, but of course, this is a key topic within civil society and organized labor and the like. So I'm very, very happy to be joined by the panelists today. The first being Dr. Neva Makgetla, whose topic is on the reconstruction and recovery, what has changed. For you who may or may not know, Dr. Neva Makgetla has been senior economist in the trade and industrial policy at TIPS since 2015. She was Deputy Director General for Economic Policy in the Economic Development Department from 2010 to 2015. Before joining EDD, she worked for the Presidency, the DBSA, COSATU, and yes, she's one with much experience. And then secondly, we will be joined by Dr. Seeraj Mohamed, whose topic will be on macroeconomic and finance policies for social development and economic transformation. Dr. Mohamed is Deputy Director for Economics in the South African Parliament Budget Office. He has worked on economic policy and development since the early 1990s. Before that, he was Associate Professor of Economics at the University of the Western Cape and Director of Corporate Strategy and Industrial Development Program. Finally, we'll also be joined by Dr. Kate Phillip, whose topic is on social transfers in a time of COVID-19, seizing opportunities from the crisis. Dr. Phillips is a program lead on the Presidential Employment Stimulus, supporting the Project Management Office in the Presidency. She was also part of the team that spearheaded the initial introduction of the Social Relief of Distress grant in response to the COVID-19 crisis. She's a development strategist working at the interface between policy and development implementation and focused on inequality and economic marginalization. There's much more to her experience. I'll just leave it there and you can check out the bios for all the various details. I'm so excited. And I just realized that I am not on camera, but let's begin with Dr. Makgetla. You have 15 minutes. I'll have it timed and each presenter has 15 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think what I wanted to talk about was reconstruction and recovery from the pandemic, what has changed. And I think really because the problem is South Africa is amongst the hardest hit in the world in terms of both the impact of the pandemic itself. So we have one of the highest death rates in the world, but also in terms of the decline in the economy and job losses. And yet it seems like the economic policy discourse is almost unchanged. Partially because the crisis is still evolving, so sometimes it's hard to see what's going on. But I think also because of confirmation bias, where we all sort of see the crisis as proving that we were right all along in whatever we were saying about what should be done. I also think that, we're in a very unequal democracy, and that means there's very long-standing policy contestation. And for all of us, it's easier to fall back on our long-standing positions to say, we know what should be done. Now we really know what should be done because there's a crisis. So in this context, I'm trying to look at just to say, here are 4 new developments that are shaped in part by South Africa's pre-existing comorbidities to try and begin to explore what has actually changed with the pandemic and how should that change our approach to the economy. You know, and the issues I want to look at are the deepening inequality, but also the fact that it, on the one hand, means it's more important that we address the structural mechanisms that reproduce it, but at the same time, the risks become even greater. That we've seen reinforced mining dependency, we've seen the impact on the budget and soaring budget deficits, and also that the prospects for high-risk industries, hospitality, entertainment, and also public transport have all become much bleaker. There are obviously other new developments we should be talking about, and I think it would be useful to put on a chat line, what do you think is important that we're missing that has changed? That is, in other words, not just to say, this is what we've always thought is important, but what do you think has changed with the pandemic? Okay, so if we look at inequality, it's been, as far as we can tell, very much reinforced by the pandemic in a couple of ways. Firstly, the pandemic itself has been associated with a more relaxed monetary policy, both in South Africa and internationally. And that in turn has led to a boom in the stock market and also higher prices for assets generally. But also deficit spending in the long run tends to reinforce inequality because the people who buy government bonds and therefore get government interest tend to be in the relatively high income group. If we look at job losses, and you know, the Stats SA has been tracking this on a quarterly basis, you know, really that we've lost over 1 million jobs. So that's about, now it's about 7%. At its worst level, it was over 10%. But virtually all of those job losses are for lower level workers. If you look at formal managers and professionals, as of the first quarter, they had fully recovered employment. And generally, what you always see is that employment grows more slowly than the GDP. So often employment losses, we saw this also in 2008, 2009, in terms of Ivor and Justin's paper, often employment lags behind the decline in GDP, both on the downside, but also on the upside. And that's what we're seeing now. But there's also been big education losses, and they're very unequal in their impact because, you know, when you have to work from home, it depends a lot what kind of home you have and what kind of broadband you have, and also how much your parents can help you with your education. We've also seen, if you judge by the quarterly labor force survey, which asks people if they're employers or self-employed, you know, the number of people who say they're employers or self-employed has dropped by about 10% since before the pandemic. And it's been disproportionately Black-owned formal small business that is closed. And of course, the vaccination program and healthcare are also deeply unequal. It's much easier to get a vaccination if you have a smartphone and a car, just because of the way it's been set up. And similarly for healthcare, you're much more likely to get better healthcare if you're in the private sector. So what this also means is that recovery, I mean, one of the main results is that, as we've recently seen, but even before then, recovery of the economy is always going to be slowed by contestation and protest when we have these kinds of unusually deep inequalities. And I would argue that's a feature, not a bug. In other words, it's not just that the kinds of unrest we've seen are, you know, somehow unusual. It is the way the South African society works because we are so unequal. And if we do not deal with those inequalities, we can't expect a robust recovery or sustained long-term growth. So how could we talk about the main policy responses? I would say that we talk a lot about reconstruction, but when you look at the actual measures we're looking at, it's really about recovery. That is, what can we do to make the existing economic production structure work better? How can we get rid of unnecessary burdens and costs to business, rather than saying, how do we create a more equitable society, except for some relief programs? And the relief has mostly been through the special grant plus the temporary employee relief. What is the system? I forget, which is paid for by the UIF. Neither is actually very luxurious. the special relief grant was 350 Rand, which is about 60% of the food poverty line, and the tours provided on average 3,500 a month, which is essentially the minimum wage. What we haven't done, for all the talk of reconstruction, is address the structural roots of South Africa's deep inequality, which the pandemic, like I said, have reinforced. So what are the structural roots of inequality in South Africa? In effect, the comorbidities that in the pandemic's impact is so great. One is that ownership is highly unequal. Doesn't matter what kind of assets we look at, from small business to financial assets to land and housing. The work organization and pay scales are also unusually unequal. So South Africa has some of the most unequal pay in the world. Again, education, we've done very little to make education more equitable. It's integrated at the top in terms of race, but it's not equitable if you look at it by class. You know, infrastructure is still much better in the historically white suburbs than in the rest of the country. And as we were talking about in the last session, the historic labor standing regions continue to lag far behind the rest of the country in terms of livelihoods and infrastructure, and generally the potential for economic growth. So I would say, you know, here we are in a crisis in a democracy. Why are we not able to do more to ensure that our efforts to bring about recovery have done more to bring about to address these factors leading to inequality, as opposed to just providing minimal cash transfers? You know, so why have we not done more, for instance, to support small business, to develop the township economy, to really focus infrastructure spending on low-income areas, some of those issues? And I'm giving three possible reasons, but I'd be interested to hear what other people think. Part of it that it's just difficult to promote collective action in a pandemic. It's much easier to administer individual grants, and it's faster to get them out there than to try and do things like say, how do we improve housing? How do we densify cities? How do we do land reform? Some of those issues. But there is a risk, and I hope Kate will talk to this, that you know, the relief programs that just doing cash transfers does risk displacing longer-term structural programs. So it's a question of we can do the second best now or wait for the first best. How do we manage that decision? But I do think we need to talk more about what would an effective and realistic reconstruction program look like, as opposed to just a recovery program, which is aimed at giving existing businesses and existing production structures a boost. A second issue is around mining dependency. So, you know, the mining value chain, it's only 13% of the GDP and 6% of employment before the pandemic, but it generates, for the last 20 years, it's generated around half of our exports. If you include downstream refineries, that includes Sasol as well as the metals refineries. The only advanced exports we have outside of the mining value chain are assembled autos and tourism. Our other advanced exports of goods and services really all depend on mining, that is construction services, capital goods, and financial services. Mining is also a major source of foreign indirect and direct investment through investment in the JSE, through loans, and through FDI. So in effect, it's the main way we articulate with the global economy. And when we've seen diversification, it's tended to be within mining, that is, from gold into platinum and coal and iron ore, and not away from mining into manufacturing or services. The thing about the pandemic and mining is two things. Firstly, the mines never actually closed fully, and they were amongst the first to reopen despite the high risks underground. That is, there's a high risk of contagion, particularly with underground mines, particularly in the lifts. And there have been several outbreaks that you could see in Limpopo in particular that were, and the Northwest, that you could chase back to the mines. But the prices are now well above 2011 levels. So they're the highest they've been in 30 years for most of our major mining exports, which has boosted tax revenue and led to an export surplus for the first time in a long time. And what the graph just shows is if you look at growth rates, you can see how the GDP growth rates, which are in black, really very largely trace the price of our mineral exports in US dollars. That's a trade-weighted average of our major mineral exports in US dollars. And really these things do tend to track each other since the transition to democracy, in ways that I think most of us would see as it's a closer relationship than I would have expected. What are the policy implications? Well, I kind of feel like mining is like an abusive employer. When they're charming, it makes it harder to quit. If you've had the kind of job that is half the time it's good and half the time it's terrible, you know how hard it is to get out of it. And the way that works with mining is when we're in an upcycle like we are now, the benefits are so visible that it's really hard to say, let's use some of those benefits to diversify away from mining. And it's particularly a problem because these mining cycles have become increasingly coordinated over the last 20 years. And also that there are always fluctuations in demand for individual products. So for instance, now coal is declining, but other metals that are needed for the green economy are increasing. So it's really hard to say mining overall is in a decline. But what we saw in 2011 when prices last crashed was that growth slowed down, job creation slowed down, mining lost jobs. There was also an issue that there was a sharp fall in the annual pay increases and bonuses in platinum because of low platinum prices. And that was a key factor behind the Maracana strikes. International companies began to divest, and there were big differences in regional impacts depending on the degree of mining dependency. And again, that goes back to what we heard in the last session. So Gauteng was not that badly affected, even though it's got quite a lot of mining still, and particularly refineries and metalworks. But the mining towns were often plunged into a depression. But the other thing was we had stranded infrastructure programs because key parts of the infrastructures of the build program, arguably including ESCOM, but also in terms of water and rail, were designed to serve the mines. So Transnet cut its spending early, but you can argue that a lot of the problems that ESCOM's facing is that they were assuming a continual increase in mining demand that didn't emerge. We've seen rising debt, and we've seen a rapid depreciation of the rand. And I think, again, the impact was bigger than most expected. And the reason I'm raising that is because we're now at prices that are even higher than in 2011. And I think we have to ask, how long is this price upswing likely to last? And what's going to happen when it stops? Do we think this is a really short bubble linked to the pandemic, or do we think we're on another growth cycle? Most people thought the commodity boom that lasted from the early 2000s to 2011 was largely due to growth in China. China's not doing so well now. So do we think this is really just a speculative thing, or do we think this is a longer term boom in prices? But the nature of these cycles is they always end. What should we be doing to prepare for a downturn? How can we use this period to build resilience while prices are high? So for instance, we're always talking about how do we build upstream linkages. We actually have some good ones, like I said, the construction industry, capital goods. Are there others? How can we manage the revenues in a way that avoids excessive appreciation of the rand and that promotes other industries? How do we manage diversification in the mining regions? Can we ensure that social labor plans actually help when the price falls, because up till now they've been quite weak? And should we be disincentivizing short-term capital inflows that are also reflecting relaxed monetary policy in the global north, but also are speculative investments in the mining companies, but which do tend to push up the rand, and that makes our other exports less competitive? The third issue with the pandemic is the deficit, and I'm sure Seeraj will talk to this. But the deficit, jumped to 12% because when the pandemic hit, the state very consciously maintained spending levels, even as revenues fell, which is exactly what we did in the global crisis in 2008, 2009. And as you can see from the graph, we saw a big increase in the deficit then.
Neva, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, managed to get it back. And now we have one of the biggest deficits in the world. In terms of policy responses, and I only have 2 minutes, so I'm not going to go through this slide in depth, but I think, there's always arguments for increasing the deficit and for decreasing it. And usually what it is we're on a continuum, and there's risks whatever we do. What the pandemic has done is increase the risks. But the one thing I would flag is that I think we tend to talk about South Africa as if we could raise the deficit as easily as the US. In fact, we are much weaker when it comes to negotiating with international and even national creditors. And I think that our scope for increasing the deficit may be less than if we just say, well, the US can do it. That's the classic Keynesian response, we should do that. The other argument against increasing the deficit is that the downturn due to the pandemic is not because of some kind of spontaneous decline in demand, but because of the way the pandemic has impacted our ability to produce and also demand for high-risk services. Obviously, some people disagree, and I don't know what the answer is, but I do think it's, having looked at some other countries as well in the region, the fact is, it's not that easy for a country like South Africa to simply say push up the deficit. I think we have to address those obstacles in terms of the cost of borrowing and how it escalates, and if there are not alternative sources of resources for reconstruction programs that we could look at. I mean, Saul talked about this, and again, I'm assuming we'll share the slides. I don't have time to go through it, but one last thing, which is the tourism, hospitality industries, they're not coming back anytime soon. These are very labor-intensive industries, although they're not a big part of the GDP, and people tend to exaggerate how important tourism is. If you look at the actual data, it's not that big. But the fact is they're labor-intensive. There's a lot of women and youth employed there. There's a lot of small businesses there. It's not possible for them to come back on their old business model because they are just at too high a risk of contagion. So how do we talk about what we can do to assist people in those industries? So finally, I just want to end with some questions that for everybody else to help answer, which is firstly, how have your policy ideas evolved as a result of the pandemic? I think it's important we start saying, what do we have to change, as opposed to, like I said, just do what we've always said. But also, what do you think would be priorities for a strategy for reconstruction as opposed to just recovery? And finally, how do the conditions for deficit-led stimulus differ between, say, the US and South Africa? In other words, if we wanted to do a deficit-led stimulus, what would be the obstacles we might run into, and how could we manage them better? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neva. Very thought-provoking final questions there, and I hope that we will take them up in discussions. Seeraj, please, over to you.
So here we go. Okay. So yeah, no, I think I really enjoyed Neva's thought-provoking presentation, and I think it raises a lot of the issues that I think are really important as we move through dealing with this pandemic and also the response to it, but also I mean thinking about you know, how do we get back beyond the crisis, before the crisis, as become common to say. Basani, are you hearing me okay? Okay, good. Yes. Sorry, I'm looking at my picture of my microphone on the Zoom thing, and it seems to not be showing green when I'm speaking, so which is what it usually does. Sorry. Okay, so my presentation is sort of as much less detail and numbers than Neva's, but it does sort of also follow the vein of asking questions. So I hope this is useful, and I'm willing to sort of go into some detail about numbers and questions and things later. But as I was doing this, I thought because of the limited time, I often get caught up trying to show people and convince them that my graphs are what's happening and you should interpret the way I'm saying it. I rather thought I'd just ask the questions that I think are important. So to start, I've got two questions I comment. One is, you know, why is the South African discussion on economic transformation so deplete of analysis of macroeconomics and finance? And why does it sound like 1990s neoliberal thinking? And yeah, I'm thinking particularly about people in government and national treasury. You know, if we go back, and maybe it's because some of the leadership came through you know, that period in the transition and sort of starting to think about power and running the economy, when those kind of questions were phrased the way in which the Washington Consensus phrased it, as it was very dominant. But I mean, we've now seen a real decline in a lot of the assumptions and approaches at macro and finance in that thinking, but South Africa still seems to be stuck in it. So the second question is, why are the huge changes in our macroeconomic, both monetary and fiscal policy and practice, and the major changes in global financial architecture and operation of the global financial system, why are they not a more intrinsic part of our discussion of social development and economic transformation in South Africa? And I mean, I appreciate Neva's talking about sort of you know, the bubbles and the size of the deficits and those things, but I really worry that, you know, especially people who work on industrial policy, on sectors, on microeconomic things, people work on social development and social security, the approach doesn't actually say this is the macro environment, this is the financial environment we work in, and this has been a bugbear of mine for a long time. And you'll notice that I didn't write the word financialization in that bullet point, but you know, we haven't thought about and put it into our work and analysis and policy proposals of what's happened within the global economy and South African economy, that there've been huge era large changes that have happened, and we're not really looking at them. And so my comment is, these changes are so large and momentous that even the most specialized microeconomists and industry sector specialists really do not have an excuse for not seriously considering the impacts of global integration, finance, and macroeconomic practice. And I don't go into what I mean by seriously considering, but at this point, after a few years, I'm willing to say just considering the impacts of these things. I actually just stuck in these two graphs in the last 10 minutes while Neva was talking. And I was planning not to show data, but this is from the Atlantic Council, and they look at quantitative easing. And the thing about quantitative easing is that it was seen as unconventional policy in 2010, when it was started being used in the US and Europe. It was being used in Japan, you know, much earlier. And now, you know, as we've gone even before the COVID pandemic, we see that it's become conventional monetary policy. The quantitative easing has become part of the toolbox, and it seems to be almost a part of the toolbox that's really hard for central banks and governments to not use. And if you look at 2019 to 2020, you see this huge increase in quantitative easing. And basically a lot of that, and linked to what Neva was saying, is central banks buying up assets. A lot of them, if you look at the blue part, sorry, when I copied this, the legend seemed to not have come out, but the blue part is actually subprime loans and mortgage-backed securities, those kinds of things. You'll notice that basically stays on the books. I mean, the people were talking about, you know, government liquidating those toxic assets and stuff, but if one goes into the history of financial crises and bailouts, you'll see that a lot of what happens is that central bank balance sheets just sort of increase, take into account the impacts of the bailouts and move on, and it gets forgotten about. And so in answer to Neva's question about fiscal policy, I'm sort of preempting what I'm going to say a bit later. You know, if governments around the world, and not only in developed countries, these would be sort of the Bank of England, Bank of Japan, the US Fed, European Central Bank in this picture. But we're seeing it, especially with the pandemic in developing countries. If central banks can spend so much money bailing out the financial sector, the private financial sector of the world, in order to maintain, one is what they see as financial stability, which I don't think this is actually doing. And you spoke about the bubbles, and we're seeing an exacerbation of inequality, but we're also seeing that's kind of the global imbalance that happened even before the global financial crisis being very much in place. And if governments can do this for the private financial sector, why can't they do this for governments? And in fact, a lot of what we're seeing in this graph and the increases are linked to how central banks are financing government debt in primary and secondary markets. And here we've got a graph that shows up to 2018. So I did this in a rush. Just while Neva was talking, so I couldn't find something in that 3-minute period that shows 2019-20. But this is how the ownership of central banks of government debt, and again just showing the big four. But with the crisis, we've seen many countries, and some countries actually changing their laws about whether central banks should be able to buy government debt as a response to COVID. So what has happened? So what has happened? The fact was that unconventional monetary policy a decade ago has through practice become conventional and has a huge bearing on everything. The fact that mainstream neoclassical economists of all stripes are positioning their previous beliefs that fiscal policy is ineffective and should be avoided at all costs should be at least cause most people working on policy to pause and think about fiscal policy in South Africa. However, there's a general refrain that South Africa is in a fiscal crisis, that government cannot afford to spend more, and that the levels of debt are unsustainable. We fear a fiscal cliff. Unfortunately, this is a term that has entered into the South African discourse in a very large way, and people use it fairly unthinkingly, I think, and we should be careful of that. So how do we move forward? Now, the first question for me is sort of linked to, I think, about the role of the developmental state. And can we trust government and its officials in South Africa? Can Mazukata's appeal to change the way we think about the state and its employees happen in South Africa? Can we move towards recognizing capabilities that exist, reward existing competence, and build greater capacity, where the discourse shifts from the neoliberal distrust of the state towards one where we see state employees working in the public good and nurture their confidence, creativity, and support innovation, and support them in trying to build a developmental state? Can we shift the approach to
Okay, perhaps let's move on to Kate, and then we'll kind of close with Seeraj. Kate, is that all right with you?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Perfection, thank you.
And Seeraj left it at a key question around fiscal space and how it's seen, and it leads quite nicely into this next one. Okay, are we all up? Is it showing? Yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
So Neva has asked some very profound questions and important ones, and Seeraj was certainly going in the same direction. The focus in my presentation is on the art of the possible and on the pragmatics of some of these questions. So I'm focused on social transfers in a crisis and the extent to which we have and maybe haven't seized opportunities of the moment. So I don't have to explain this to this audience. Unemployment was a significant crisis before COVID. And a critical feature of our particular landscape of unemployment and social protection is that we have had a long-standing social protection gap, where there is a cohort of the unemployed that receive no form of support at all. So unemployed people without access to UIF or any other form of grant support. Now, I know that the child support grant is targeted at the children and not at the caregiver. It nevertheless provides an indirect mechanism of support. But there are a cohort of people amongst the unemployed who receive no support at all. It is in fact mainly young men that fall into this gap. And that is not a good recipe for a society. And it's a recipe that we've had for a long time. It often surprises me that we don't have more analysis of the gender dimensions of the social protection gap and how it plays into other challenges that we face. So then along came the COVID crisis. We had those crises already, but now we've confronted hunger rising, poverty and inequality foregrounded. Interestingly, we saw starkly the role that the informal sector has been playing as a cushion, because it was when it was removed from the equation, things got so much worse. Food parcels were horrifyingly limited. Food vouchers came into play, but they have their limitations too. And it's in that context that the question was posed, what about a special COVID grant? And the PMO and the Presidency asked for a team to be set up to explore it, which I headed. And I won't go into the detail of the motivation for that, but the analysis that was provided in support of that process by Saldru made a very compelling case that a combination of increasing the child support grant and closing the social protection gap were vital instruments in the time of crisis. I've used a quote from Milton Friedman on the right, and interestingly, it kind of echoes something Neva was saying, which is that it's the ideas that are lying around that get picked up, and actually maybe we need some new ones. So my apologies for using Milton Friedman, but I do think that it resonates that it's only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And certainly the idea of closing the social protection gap with a big or with some other form of transfer was not a new idea, but the moment, in a sense, was seized. I want to focus on the pragmatics of this kind of intervention. So why did we need a special COVID grant? To be honest, that part was clear. That was the easy part. The real question was how, and it speaks a bit to what Seeraj was touching on, the issue of state capabilities, because the question of whether or not we got a special COVID grant, in the end, I would argue, was as much about whether we could do it than whether we should do it. So increasing the CSG was technically easy, but could we seize the opportunity to close the social protection gap? SASSA offices were closed, queues had to be avoided, means testing was out of the question. People would have to register to be vetted. We needed payment systems. We'd have to avoid ID theft, phishing, and fraud. We'd have to reach the unbanked. Fiscal space was extremely constrained. We can argue about it, but certainly the message at the time was that we couldn't even put on the table a proposal that was for over about 8 million people. And even there, that was highly contested. The targeting of the poorest had to be robust. Did we have the capabilities to roll out a grant of this kind? It took a full year simply to upload CSG beneficiaries into the banking system when that decision was made. Could we really roll out a grant in 6 weeks? Could we rely on implementation capacity in the state? Because we had problems enough, but to promise a grant and then fail to deliver it would really be high risk indeed. And it was that fear and that risk that was one of the biggest constraints on getting the grant approved, because who in government would be brave enough to say, we can do it, let's do it. So some of the work that then had to happen in the background was about how could a grant be done? And a critical insight was that joined up data could avoid traditional means testing. Up until now, SASSA has relied on in-person means testing for the child support grant. We don't have electronic or digital or other mechanisms of doing means testing. It hasn't happened here before. In theory, we could avoid that by joining up Home Affairs data and then excluding all those on, for example, UIF, PAYE, SASSA, NSFAS, and so on. The problem that was confronted is that this data had never been joined up before. These data sets sit in different departments under different mandates, regulatory frameworks, privacy regimes. They're in different and often incompatible data systems. To join them up required permissions from every DG. There were legal issues, there were IT challenges, there were turf issues. To be honest, this component of the implementation of the grant that took place in the background was critical and risky and It wasn't always certain that it was achievable. It was a deal breaker, though. There was no other way to roll out this grant than to join up the data. So who could do it? Who could do it in the timeframes? The clock was ticking. So SARS agreed to do it, and they did. And they became the repository of the data from all these different sources, and they did the joining up because they had the technical capability, and they agreed that it was a crisis and it was necessary to do this, even though it wasn't strictly in their mandate or in their mandate at all. But because of the crisis, it was agreed that they would do it, and they did. And it was on that basis that it was possible to create an online registration mechanism, which had also never happened before, an online registration mechanism, join up the data and assess people's eligibility against a set of joined up data sets. Next critical problem was, how could applicants be registered, vetted, and securely paid, and done digitally and online? And that's when enter the Special Payments Task Team. A task team was brought together under the leadership of the Reserve Bank, supported by the Payments Association of South Africa and many banks and fintech organizations. There were at least 30 people in this team. What was fascinating was the alacrity with which the players participated in this process to solve a social problem. And what enabled it was the fact that the Competition Act had been suspended in the context of COVID to allow this kind of collaboration, because normally these players could not come together to collaborate to find a solution to a pressing social problem. These were the evaluation criteria that were agreed, that the mechanism of uploading, vetting, and payment had to support both the banked and the unbanked. It had to be simple, easy to access the funds. It needed to be proven and reliable. There wasn't the time or the space for innovation. Actually, we needed systems that we knew that worked, had to be safe and secure, easy to pay out with a rapid time to market. And the steps that had to be considered, the onboarding, how would people register? How would they be verified? How would we stop ID fraud? People registering on multiple IDs on one phone number, how would we do the approval? The disbursement and the payout process was about the payment funding, the value stores, the disbursement, and of course, the AG hovering over it all, the auditability, the traceability, and the transparency. So the task team broke it down into all of these different stages. I'm not going to go into the detail of this. This is simply to illustrate what is involved in actually moving from a good policy idea to rolling out a social grant in 6 weeks. Every single step along this chain involved some level of innovation, not innovation in the sense that these things had never been done before, but innovation in the sense that they'd never been done in government in quite this way before. So it was quite a remarkable process. And the point is this, that yes, a crisis creates opportunities for change, to move from the politically impossible, for the politically impossible to become inevitable. But it's not enough for the rationale to be good. It's not enough for the policy idea to be good. The deal breaker is not whether it should be done, but how can it be done? And my argument here is that too often in our policy discussions, we stop at the rationale, at the demand, at the statement of need, and assume that if that is compelling enough, it will be persuasive enough and it will happen. Of course, those matter, but what is as important, if not sometimes more important, what gets it over the line is how can it be done? And that requires the detailed work on implementation systems, technologies, buy-in from institutions. So the point here is that policy change is only partly about evidence. It's crucially about political economy, about strategy and tactics, but as crucially about plausible implementation design and seizing the moment. Now, at the time, there were complaints that the process was very slow. I'm told from Kate Orkin that in fact the rollout of the SRD was one of the fastest rollouts of a social grant in the world. And I think it's important sometimes to recognize what has to go on behind the scenes to turn a good policy idea into a fact on the ground that then influences future policy and possibilities. And of course, the question that is asked is the chances of converting the SRD to a big. And a brief note on this is just to say, this is less about whether it is desirable than whether it is doable, because the case has now not only been made in theory, but in practice, and the evidence in this regard is very clear. It's heavily about fiscal feasibility, and that's where Seeraj needs to come back into the discussion. And a factor in this mix is the extent to which the policy can have stimulus effects on the wider economy, a point that Neva ended up with. Because the debate at the moment is a debate of we can't afford more relief, we need to invest in growth. And a critical part of this equation is, can these measures contribute to growth? There's lots of global evidence, but South Africans don't like global evidence. We need evidence of our own. And just to note that right now there's a call for research proposals from the AFD to look at this very question. And I would encourage any of those in the audience who want to participate in that. Very briefly, I'm also going to look at the presidential employment stimulus, because the next big question was, with unemployment—
3 minutes.
Cool. With the loss of jobs at that scale, could we create jobs at scale and in hostile timeframes? The budget that was allocated for the employment stimulus was allocated in October and had to be spent by March. Could we do it? Many said we couldn't. This is how we've done so far. We have had rollovers for a lot of these funds, so the 5-month window has been slightly extended. We did achieve 90% of the target on the jobs. But the critical issue here, the critical lessons, were lessons about designing for scale. And I just want to highlight that for all that many departments made important contributions, the real lessons of scale were from DBE and from the agriculture program. And I'll very quickly highlight those. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Basic Education Employment Initiative. Nearly 320,000 young people were in post within 6 weeks of the announcement of the stimulus. It's been a program that has really been embraced by all stakeholders in the school system, with some key areas of innovation. So firstly, the fact that a mobile platform was used for the recruitment. Every young person who applied was geospatially located and linked to the nearest schools, and it provided valuable data and enabled the system of recruitment to be very quick, so that over 250,000 people had been appointed and were in post within 6 weeks of the announcement of the stimulus. They also did a lot of innovation in terms of training. The minister put a lot of emphasis on the fact that she wanted a training component in the program. That required partnership with the non-state sector to create online learning mechanisms. And they managed to roll out training for over 150,000 of the participants, with a huge amount of collaboration and partnership and innovation in the methodologies. I think an important part about this program is both the meaning of the work and the social value created. You know, we saw this as an opportunity for a bit of a reset that would demonstrate that public employment really can create both meaningful work and real social value. And I think with this program, that has certainly been demonstrated. Important also was that it has paid the national minimum wage. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about the agriculture production input vouchers. Again, innovation in the sense that for the first time, a USSD platform was used. Over 178,000 subsistence farmers applied. Again, significant scale in short timeframes. There's been on-site verification of applicants. Over 84,000 have been verified. And one of the benefits here is that for the first time, we now have a geospatially referenced database of subsistence farmers in the country based on their different productive activities. And it provides an important basis for pathways out of poverty and for building on that geospatially referenced database, and now crowding in different forms of support as we move into further phases. But again, important innovation that's enabled scale that we are hoping to build on. So this is my last slide, which is that the context of crisis created pressure to take risks because the risks of inaction were so strongly foregrounded. But taking risks in government isn't easy. But anytime we do things differently, it entails risk, but implementation is complex. Not everything will go smoothly. If I had double the time, I could tell you all the things that have gone wrong. There were no shortage of them. The challenge, though, is that there have been gains. How do we embed them? How do we embed the lessons? How do we incentivize the innovation? The reality is that public officials in 11 departments stepped forward to take on more work, because this was more work. And it was more work over the Christmas break period, and people stepped forward to take it on. And in that space, a lot of space was created for initiative that was actually taken up. How do we build that into our capable state? And last point, how do we optimize the stimulus effects of these instruments? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was great. Thanks. Seeraj, do you want to just finish up quickly?
Okay,
I'm going to give you literally 3 minutes.
So my ending's going to be different, and I just want to start with saying I really like Kate's input, and I wish I could be as optimistic about anything as she is about what's happened. It's a bit almost like that movie Invictus. You know, we see Mandela wearing the rugby jersey at the end, and things. South Africa's come out victorious, but I'm too cynical a person for that. So I mean, I think. Well, the kind of things Kate's talking about is almost like the reverse of Naomi Klein's shock therapy. It's almost like the neoliberals are now being shocked by the crisis of COVID to actually get their shit in order, and start doing things that they could have been doing a long time ago. But for me, it's actually been ideological, and that was sort of what I was pointing into the earlier parts of my presentation, and is that there is capacity, there is capability, there is the ability to coordinate and work with the private sector and to use private finance for good rather than the evil that it's been doing. But there's been a choice not to do it. Just the same way that government could be spending a huge amount more money on social security, on basic services, on putting in place public works programs. And if they had been doing that since before the global financial crisis, at the time when debt was, 35% of GDP, and then they were still complaining that it was too high and that they needed to keep running surpluses, we could have actually avoided a lot of the problems. We also could have avoided the kind of unhappiness and suffering that I think led to the stuff we saw after Zuma's arrest. So the state has the ability and the capacity, and I think what I was saying is that we have a situation. I'll end off at this point. The financial economist Eileen Grable, in talking about what's happened with the discussion about whether countries should use capital controls or not, uses the term that she's taken from Albert Hirschman called productive incoherence. I think that now applies to the whole field of macroeconomics and finance. The fact that developed countries have used quantitative easing and other things, and that's become part of their toolbox. The fact that so much money is being provided by central banks to finance government debt and to buy basically countries out of financial and economic problems sets the ability for South Africa to totally rethink our approach to finance, to fiscal policy, to monetary policy. And we're not doing it, we're not taking it. We're sort of somehow stuck in this 1990s Washington consensus neoliberal argument. And there's a huge opportunity to shift the debate and also shift ideology, to see the state as being capable and being able to put in place policies to deal with social security. The other thing I'd like to say is, when we think about debt, and is debt a problem, and can we refinance debt, what we really need to think about the role of central banks and what is possible and what is not possible. But also, in a situation where we've got so much poverty and inequality and people at the edge of poverty, and things could so easily blow up. We really need to think of, well, can we afford not to do that? Can we afford not to spend the money, not to have the deficits, and not to have the debt? And how much can we actually push at that? What is the envelope? So I want to end there. And so I don't really answer the questions. I think I would like you guys to think about those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of those. Those were great provocations that we received from all three presenters. You'll see that our chat is like exploding with a range of comments. I'm just going to limit my question to one so I can get to those, and then I will dive in a bit further. And my question is to Neva, which is, I mean, Neva, thank you, brilliant presentation. You kind of like helped to frame this discussion very well, and it quite linked with what Seeraj ended up saying, what Kate was also, the details that Kate gave. And you mentioned the fact that, in mentioning the fact that, you know, we're good at getting the COVID grants, you know, in. However, this is at the surface of the deeper structural issues that we actually need to be dealing with, and it doesn't seem like and the way in which we've done social security, or the focus in the way in which we've done it doesn't seem transformative enough, based on the number of structural issues that you mentioned, from education to ownership, participation, and the like. And you mentioned the fact that you know, it boils down to collective action. And Kate kind of like was obviously talking about how collective action worked within the COVID, within the looking at the social security. But I was interested for you to kind of unpack perhaps more the political economy issues that you foresee as being a challenge in the greater structural transformation issues that you were alluding to, right? So is it a question of the fact that as Kate mentions, are the demands perhaps less, not as good, or are we stopping at the level of demands? Are the issues that we are talking about, are they actually implementable? Is it a question of, or like, is it a question of ideology, as Seeraj is talking about? So just to lay, just to ask you about that, if you could just unpack that, and then I'll go straight into the chats.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I have to say, if we had the answers, we could fix it. But what I will say is, I think that, you know, really what you're talking about is, why is it so hard in a democracy? You would think that state policy would reflect the needs of the majority. And I think the trouble is, in a highly unequal democracy, it's very difficult to ensure that happens, particularly where you have a dominant party. And, you know, from my point of view, it's a dominant party because the opposition is really weak. But the fact is, people don't have anybody else to vote for, so they vote for the ANC, and then they do protest action to show that when they're dissatisfied, because they don't want to vote for the other party. So the way democracy is supposed to hold government accountable to do the kinds of things Seeraj and Kate are talking about is by having people have the risk of being voted out if they don't. And that, you know, the real debates about this stuff now are inside the ANC, not outside the ANC. And that right there means that that democratic mechanism doesn't work very well. At least that's what the political scientists I know tell me. Having said that, I think that, you know, that's the very abstract level, that in a highly divided society, it's always, you know, it's always hard to change economic structures. It's very hard when you have a democracy, which in theory gives everybody, you know, one person, one vote, at least one citizen, one vote. And the economy gives power to a very small group. And to use the political leverage to change that is hard. Those people in the economy have power outside of policy. So that's the most fundamental problem. And I would argue that really we reached a compromise with people like that in the transition, that the compromise was we would get rid of racial laws, we would give workers rights, we would desegregate government services, and we would use government services to raise living standards. And that over time was supposed to lead to a more equitable and inclusive economy in terms of a more diversified production structure, more small business, more ownership by collectives and individuals, and a less concentrated economy. And really, we haven't delivered on that. And I think, you know, all the evidence is inequality hasn't gotten worse since 94, but it also hasn't gotten better. Unemployment hasn't gotten worse since 94, but it hasn't gotten better. We haven't made those structural shifts. And I do think that the thing about collective action is that social grants are very much about giving money to individuals. It's collective action by the state to do it, as Kate described, but it's not helping people have agency directly, except to the extent it may help in terms of their ability as households and families to engage with the economy, but it's very incremental. So yeah, so I just think that really it's about the accountability of the state, it's about the structure of the state and how it can be held accountable on the one hand, and on the other hand, how far can we go in managing the realities of economic power? And we don't really talk about that very much, and what that economic power is in reality. And how far we're prepared to go to take those risks. Because the one thing I want to say finally, sorry, one could of course go on all day about this, but I think that would be unfair. But the one thing I would like to say is I think what somebody said, one of the problems with the government that we have and the bureaucracy and the systems we inherited is they tend to punish the risks of innovation, but they don't punish risks that result from inaction. So it was easy to cut off a new grant in April. And it led to, you know, it definitely helped contribute to the uprising that we saw. It was much harder to get people to take the risk of putting that grant out in the first place and to reinstate it afterwards, because those are innovations and it's easy to see the risk of innovation. It's not so easy to see the risk of doing what you've always done. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to go straight to the quick Q&A. Thanks, Neva. Why do you make such a direct link between mining and financial services? Does financial services not make a contribution in the economy other than the capital financing of the mining sector? That's from David. I'm just going to read these out quickly. Global integration is challenged by the pandemic, as the increase in freight is pushing for increased prices of those imported items. Isn't inward investment or looking inward investment or looking now a limitation to this integration? That's from Lucindo. And then from David Walvin, a few weeks ago, I listened to a debate between Federica Donaldson and others debating about whether the South African economy is demand or supply side constrained. Stimulus packages will work if we are demand limited, but in the sectors I work, we are supply side limited. In answer to your last question about what to do, do you agree with this proposition and that the best response would be to deal with raising the level of essential public goods, including education, health, urban infrastructure, and environmental health? And then finally, from Lucindo again, public employment versus finance minister reduction of the public service. How can these employment opportunities be created? So I'll just leave it there. And if any of my Neva,
Basani, there are also comments and questions in the chat, not only in the questions and answers. I don't know if you want to look at that while people are speaking, sort of while Neva responds or others.
Yes, I will. I'm going to go there. Let's just take this round quickly, and then I'll move on to the chat.
Yeah, I mean, the point is the South African financial sector originated to serve mining. Like you had this very strong financial institutions, largely because the mines needed huge amounts of capital, and the JSE, for instance, was a very important way for the mines to raise capital. And to this day, as I'm sure everybody knows, mining is disproportionately important on the JSE. And I do think that when you look at so in effect, that gave them a springboard, but it also gives them a financial base So they learned the competencies, and they got up to scale based in large part on the role they played in supporting mining. At least that's the way I read it. In terms of whether the problem is demand or supply side, look, those are important points in theory. In practice, we can't address the supply side constraints you're looking at if we're always being told that they have to cut the budget because of the deficit. So I think there is an interaction there where what were initially supply side constraints from the pandemic led to demand side problems as you get into a downward spiral with unemployment and lower earnings on the one hand, and on the other hand, like I said, you can't fix infrastructure, you can't support small business and so on if you're continuously having massive resource constraints.
Great, thank you very much. And a question to you, Seeraj, from Duma, I think. So true, Seeraj, the government could have done so much more with monetary and fiscal policy. Exactly why could we not use quantitative easing? Why can't we have direct monetary financing?
Okay, and that's the question, right? Why have government chosen a certain approach to macroeconomic policy? Why do we have inflation targeting in its current form? Why does the Reserve Bank see its role in such a narrow terms and sort of still see inflation and fighting inflation as its main concern, and talk about sort of not affecting the value of the currency? And then, you know, why are we not looking at quantitative easing and the central bank inserting more money into the economy, including through financing the deficit? And I think it's about the way in which the academic and public debate is happening in South Africa. And I sort of started off saying, you know, why do people not talk about finance and macroeconomics? And I think as an academic community, as economists, as people who work on social security, as people who work on industrial policy and development, you know, there's a need to actually start getting involved in those debates, because your ability to implement an industrial policy, your ability to actually provide social security, to have a public works program, to improve people's lives, where unemployment is structural, is going to depend on these kinds of debates. And I just sort of took a very brief and sometimes one could also describe it as simplistic approach, saying, you know, this is what's happened in developed countries on monetary policy and on fiscal policy. And why aren't we having that debate with much more rigor and intensity in South Africa? Why isn't the public involved? Why do we have newspapers that don't raise those kinds of questions? And you know, why isn't more research going into that? Why are those old 1990s mainstream views? The mainstream has shifted in their perspectives on what fiscal policy can do, what monetary policy should look like, and what's capable. The practice has shifted the theory, and the willingness of mainstream macroeconomists around the world to change their views on their theory and what's possible. But in South Africa, we don't seem to be doing that. So yeah, I suppose I'm answering your question with another question. Thanks.
Thank you. And Kate, you've also had quite a lot of engagement on yours. And the question is, hi, from Rehan Fissa. Hi, Kate, please could you give some examples of things that went wrong and challenges you experienced with the grants and public employment programs? And just to stay with you there, someone else said, thank you for this insight, Kate. It has given me much hope for our country and what we can accomplish, albeit within a window of time of pressure and chaos. I agree with Seeraj that these are the things we should have done before. These are recipes we can absolutely apply going forward. I just want to, yes, okay, maybe just if you can just answer that question and then I'll get back.
I mean, I think the important thing just up front, and I think it's important that the panel is complementary in many ways. I mean, I do think it's important to emphasize that the social transfer interventions, okay, they were precipitated by a particular crisis, the COVID crisis, but they were responding to poverty and inequality and unemployment that predated that. And I think what is important to recognize is that the real challenge are the big structural changes. We often say about the public employment, the employment stimulus, that it's plan B. Plan A is that we get the economic fundamentals right so that the economy is creating employment and decent work at the scale that is required, and that we don't have the problems of poverty that we're now having to respond to with these kinds of interventions. So I think it's very important just to frame the discussion in that way, and to understand that ideally we shouldn't have to make these interventions, and these interventions don't let us off the hook of the really difficult questions Neva was asking, and Seeraj as well. In terms of what went wrong, I mean, I think there are a number of areas. So the queues at the post offices were suboptimal in terms of the SRD grant. And actually they were avoidable because the levels of technical innovation actually allow for forms of payment that could have avoided that. And so there's a need to still push the envelope of innovation in that space. I think another area of problem with the schools program, there were instances of non-payment and late payment that were in fact what was mostly covered in the media. I think, to be fair, that even the private sector would concede that if you're employing 250,000 people within a space of 2 weeks, you're going to have problems uploading all of the payment mechanisms, particularly if you're doing it in the last 2 weeks of December. So to be fair, there was a context to those challenges, but what it has highlighted is the importance of innovation in the government-to-person payment space, with a lot of new digital opportunities that would allow for far greater efficiency in relation to that. One other example of a challenge, I'm sure you will have read in the media about the debacle with the National Arts Council. So the stimulus provided 3 times the normal budget to the National Arts Council to support a stimulus for the sector. And what was amazing was that over 2 billion rands worth of applications came in, which is a really interesting indication of the scale for employment creation in that sector with the right support. For the National Arts Council, though, it was a bit overwhelming. They had to, again, over the Christmas period, work their way through those 2 billion rands worth of applications. And in that process, the wheels came off, the management wheels came off, and they ended up inadvertently allocating more funds than they was in their budget. Their remedy for that was to withdraw all the awards and reduce them to back within their budget. But that caused a huge outcry, and legitimately so, because many of the people who had received awards had already committed against the grant contracts that they'd received. So that was a debacle. It was highly unfortunate. The bottom line, though, is that 21,000 people did receive direct grants for work in the creative sector through the National Arts Council. The National Film and Video Foundation also had a significant increase on their budget for this purpose, and they managed to manage it without any hitches. And over 200 productions are being supported with over 8,000 jobs created through that mechanism. But these are the kinds of disasters that befall the process. I can give more examples of things that have gone wrong, but I suspect we don't have time. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. A question from Georgina that can actually be answered by anyone on this panel. I do wonder if the pandemic response exercise has given us some insight into what government response to disasters might be. Will we be ready for more severe climate events? Question to, Kate or Neva or
Well, I do
Seeraj?
think, if I can come in, I mean, I you know, hopefully we don't have to confront a lot of disasters, but I think there are huge lessons of a practical implementation nature around how, in a context of disaster, innovation becomes essential. I think even the lessons around government-to-person payment systems are in good stead for dealing with any form of disaster going forward. Yeah, so certainly I think the lessons. Are we ready? That I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Neva, your hand is up.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the nature of disasters is you can never manage them perfectly. Having said that, I think, we did just, if you look on our website as tips, we did just do a paper on the reaction in the region. And, South Africa's done actually incredibly well in terms of both maintaining the health system and in terms of getting out relief compared to most of neighboring countries and most of the world. So, that doesn't make it good, if you see what I mean. But the health system has not collapsed, even though we've had some of the highest rates of infection and death in the world. And we did have longer standing relief programs and more extensive relief programs than most countries. I mean, every place else in the region, they promised and didn't deliver, or if they delivered, they cut it off after like 3 months. And that includes countries that have, are also upper middle income countries. So I think that, we have this post-colonial thing where we're always talking ourselves down. I think we should also recognize that we have a lot of accomplishments. Having said that, it's obviously by no means perfect. And we desperately need to say, what have we learned from this? And I think what Kate's done is really important to say, what have we learned about how we can manage better in terms of building resilience going forward? And climate change is definitely, I mean, the thing about climate change is we have time to prepare if we can use it, but having time to prepare can also lead to people being just demobilized. So we'll see where we end up. So.
Thank you. Seeraj, your closing remarks before I wrap up the session.
Just if I can come in on that question, but also I see there's a comment by Justin in the question and answers, if I can respond to both quickly.
Yes.
I worry. I mean, I think Neva's right to some extent, especially with health care, and I think the experience with HIV/AIDS, with tuberculosis and other things has sort of given us some space in our healthcare facilities, as inadequate as it is for most of the population, to be able to respond to to a crisis. But looking at what's happened in Germany and China recently with flooding, the wildfires in California and other places, also having lived through a fire coming down the mountain close to my house in Cape Town recently, I don't think we are prepared, and I think much more should be done. But the point I want to make is that by, the one way in which we can do that, respond to disasters, is by making households and poor people more resilient to disaster striking. And they are the ones that are worst affected by it. I think it is going to come. And so we need to actually put money into their pockets, provide them with the security that there will be increased money when the disaster strikes and jobs are lost and economic activity is down. And that, to some extent, I'd like to see a change in government's attitude to the way they're talking about, government support to Sasria. Governments become almost like the lender of last resort, or the insurer of last resort for the destruction that was caused after Zuma's arrest. And Sasria only has 15 billion in assets, and governments basically says, it's going to step in at some point. We don't know how much money. It seems like a blank check at the moment. But I mean, why isn't that kind of thinking towards South African society as a whole, not just business? And this sort of brings me to Justin's question. My pessimism, Justin. Let me read it quickly in case people haven't seen it. Seeraj, if you are pessimistic but realistic about the capability of the state, how do you reconcile increased debt, fiscal stimulus that would actually translate into a growing economy? You could end up with the worst of both worlds. And you know, I actually think that the approach of government should be to put in place automatic stabilizers in terms of unemployment insurance, supporting children and old people and the unemployed, the sort of the ones that are left out. And within that system, it should actually automatically increase when there's sort of a recession of a certain depth or disaster, and that should kick in irrespective. And that should, rather than this central banks be independent, that should be independent of the government of the day. You know, those kind of social security measures, and undoubtedly, you know, those kind of automatic stabilizers have been shown through history to actually reduce the impacts of recessions, disasters, crises, etc. And so putting that money into the economy isn't going to give us the worst of both worlds. You can put it in place even if you are pessimistic about capabilities, or you still need to develop capabilities, or the state's capabilities are being directed towards neoliberal ends and supporting finance and financialization and deindustrialization rather than productive activities and social security. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the chats are exploding with questions. Unfortunately, this is where we have to leave the sessions. Thank you to all three presenters. That was really such thought-provoking questions. And I think just to echo the sentiment from the attendees, thank you for your provocations. I think Neva's provocation around, you know, we have this crisis. How are we, you know, has anything that we propose as reform, has it actually changed in light of the crisis? And it's quite clear that no. But that we are being moved and shifted towards shifting things. Thank you very much. I will leave it there and hand over to the organizers.
Thanks very much, Basani and the panelists. That was a fantastic closing session. This is the last bit of the conference where we have our closing remarks, and thank you to everyone who's participated and been on the panel and engaged in a very rigorous and robust chat discussion and some very insightful questions. I now hand over to Dr. Tebogo Makube, who is the Chief Director at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition in the Industrial Procurement and Development Division. And he's more importantly the chair of the TIPS board. So over to you, Tebogo, for closing remarks. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Son. Fellow board members of TIPS, program directors, Mr. Saul Levin, Prof. Fiona Tragena, distinguished panelists and participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to offer these concluding remarks. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the Executive Director of TIPS and staff members for organizing this important forum, particularly in the year in which TIPS is celebrating its 25th anniversary. What a milestone. We have had good attendance and participation at this forum. Hopefully next year we can meet in person. I've been impressed by the quality of panelists and session discussions. The presentation provides us with serious food for thought, as well as solid recommendations about the way forward. I would like to highlight a couple of issues which I've noted. We remain in the midst of difficult and challenging period caused by COVID-19 pandemic, which is having a negative impact on the global economy, including South Africa. Supply chains and capital flows have been disrupted and in certain cases stalled. Thus, this theme of the forum becomes very relevant, especially the aspect of inclusivity, which has various layers and dimensions. Inclusivity means access to economic resources. At an international level, particularly at this juncture, it means access to COVID-19 vaccines in order to improve the health and productivity of the people globally. Inclusivity in this regard means access to the intellectual property rights, in particular licenses by developing countries to manufacture vaccines. There are interesting developments in South Africa, with Aspen having partners with Johnson & Johnson to co-produce vaccines. Others are to follow. Through partnerships, more can be done to localize manufacturing of medical supplies in this country. The question, though, is, are vaccines public goods and inclusive? I'll leave it to you to write about that. In the midst of this, we have heard that South Africa, and we all know that South Africa is having structural economic challenges accompanied by slow economic growth, declines in industrial production, increases in unemployment rate, unreliability of electricity supply in some areas, unreliability of water supply, if not lack of access to those important resources. These challenges are leading to wealth destruction, as noted by the UCT Liberty Institute. Therefore, industrial policy needs to be supported by a hybrid of policy instruments and institutions, all aimed at lowering the cost of production in South Africa. Infrastructure-led industrial development will also assist through multiplier effects, provided such infrastructure is delivered on time and with minimum incidence of corruption, because that is an anathema to growth. There can be manageable cost overruns, but delivery on time is important. We don't want another Medupi, because it is the cost to the economy. We appreciate that no manufacturing there or the building of Medupi Power Station is done, but it's late and it has cost the country. Now, the other challenges that the country is facing require unprecedented counter policy responses, both in measures and in scale. This requires a rigorous sense of collaboration, flexibility, and innovation. Therefore, the design of policy instruments, both on the supply and demand side, is critical. We have heard from Prof. Justin Barnes and Bongeni Ndlovu that in Japan, sub-national governments, in particular municipalities, are also involved in supporting the autos industry. In South Africa, sub-national governments have no fiscal space to support industrial policy. A case in point is the relocation of clover from Lichtenberg in Northwest, blaming the local municipality for poor service delivery. So we need to be very innovative. And I agree with Seeraj that we have to reform the fiscal policy in order to support the industrial policy in South Africa. This is not an easy path to navigate. And lastly, the other issue of interest is energy supply in South Africa. And also linked to that is environmental protection versus economic growth. This is another challenging area which involves difficult trade-offs in just transition framework. In the context of South Africa, it also touches on the issue of inclusivity, We are noting that the space for private participation in the field of energy supply is being expanded, and that changes the dynamics and whether energy still remains a public good. It's debatable. So that requires clear crafted policies, strategies, and implementation for South Africa to propel economic momentum and inclusivity. TIPS is well suited to inform policy choices through high quality research and policy dialogues such as this forum. Your contribution and participation is therefore much appreciated. I thank you for your attention. Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much to Tebogo for those closing remarks and for some excellent inputs on what's going on in the economy and some key issues. Thanks very much, everyone. We've come to the end of our conference, and thank you to all who've participated and for the lively debate and discussion. Watch this space. We'll continue with more development dialogues for the next over the next couple of months, and we will again circulate our invitations. Thanks, and have a good afternoon. Goodbye, everyone.